Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you all for coming here to watch me defend my doctoral thesis. In 2001, when I started studying environmental regulation at Roskilde University, the European Environment Agency published a book called The Precautionary Principle: Late Lessons from Early Warnings. It's the blue one that you see up here. The work at the European Environment Agency was pioneered by David G. here, and Paul Heramus, who used to be a director of our department at DTU Environment. He helped steer this publication through the muddy waters of politics back then in Europe. The report and the second report, the follow-up, Late Lessons 2, that came out in 2013, they go through a bunch of case studies, 28 in total, where they look at past cases of lack of application of the precautionary principle and tries to extract lessons that we can learn for future generations on how to deal with chemicals, new technologies, new processes, etc. The conclusions from the first volume back in 2001 was that lack of regulatory action had been very costly for society and had had unpredicted consequences both for health as well as the environment. Decision makers had very often ignored not only late warnings, or not only early warnings, but also late warnings. In 2013, a second volume came out, which added a number of conclusions to this previous list, where it actually indicates that the science was available in many cases. Regulators were simply not able to pick up on the science and react accordingly to protect health and the environment. A second conclusion was that we really needed to rethink the role of risk assessment. There's very few cases of over-regulation when it comes to health and the environment. And then finally, that well-designed precautionary measures can actually spark innovation within industries. And those were kind of like the extract of these two volumes. So throughout my work career, I've tried to look into how can we avoid that nanomaterials becomes another late lesson. Another case where we failed to react to early warning signs and we failed to implement precautionary measures. And that's kind of been my main driver in the work that I've done here at DTU. So since 2009, I've focused on 3 overall research areas. Now, the first is to map the current uses of nanomaterials in Europe. The second one is to understand the limitations of various pieces of existing legislation. And finally, I've worked on trying to address the restraints of risk assessments and alternative to risk assessments when it comes to nanomaterials. This work has led me to conclude that the existing legislative processes or the existing legislation is simply not up to the task of dealing with nanomaterials. We need a new piece of legislation that deals specifically with nanomaterials in order to address the unique properties that nanomaterials have and also to avoid all the muddy waters that comes with trying to implement nanomaterials into existing legislation on, for instance, chemicals or biocides, etc. This is more urgent than ever in my perception. When we started looking into nanomaterials here at DTU Environment back in 2005, this was a picture of the future. This is what people told us, that this was what nanomaterials was in the future going to be used for. But the future is actually now, because we have all of these applications are out there now. They're implemented in our society, and they have actually been for years. We have OLEDs for displays. We have implants that are based on nanotechnology that use nanomaterial surfaces. We have all of these different applications. What's also thought-provoking is that back in 2005, people were also telling us that nanomaterials were going to be as pervasive in our society as electricity is. And I don't think we are there yet, but it does really provide food for thought that we really need to address this urgently. It's quite tragic that still, despite those many years ago, we still don't quite know how nanomaterials are actually used and what's on the market, especially when it comes to consumer products. It's unclear what's on the market. It's unclear what consumers are exposed to. It's unclear how much consumers and the environment is exposed to. And of course, all of this lack of information really hampers quantitative consumer and environmental exposure assessments. Over the years, we became increasingly frustrated with this lack of information, lack of overview. So in 2012, we initiated the establishment of the Nano database, which is an online inventory where we try to keep track of all the products that are available to European consumers, where the producers are making some kind of claim about nano, whatever their definition of nano actually is. We run the database, we run it still, and we initiated back in the day with help from the Danish Eco Council and the Danish Consumer Council. There's two criteria for including products in the database. First, there has to be some kind of nano claim made by the producer of the product. We don't have the resources nor the intent to actually validate those nano claims. But if they make a claim about nano, then we add it to our database and we add all the information about the product that we're able to find. The second criteria is that it can be purchased by European consumer. So that means that if you have a credit card, for instance a Danish credit card, that you're able to buy it online and get it exported to Denmark. At the moment, we have a little more than 3,000 products in our inventory. And that has actually increased markedly over the years. When we began back in 2012, there was a little more than 1,200 products in the database. And now we have more than 3,000 products. So you can see that there's a gradual increase, and it's actually only dependent on how many resources we put into updating the database. The more resources, the more students that help me add products to the database, the more products we add. We've never been out of products to add to our database in all the years that we've worked with this database. If we look a little bit more into detail of some of the information that's available in our inventory, you can actually see that there's a great variation in which kinds of products are in our inventory. So we have quite a lot, more than half of the products fall into the category of health and fitness. It might be sports gear like badminton rackets, baseball rackets, golf clubs, and etc. It could also be cosmetic products, personal care products, and etc. The second largest category we have is home and garden. There's a lot of sealant products in this category, and then it slowly fades out to some of the other categories. If we look into a little bit more detail, we can actually identify which kinds of nanomaterials are claimed to be used in the different products across the whole inventory. What you see here, for instance, in the category of health and fitness, there's a large chunk of the products for which we do not know which material the producer is actually using. The producer is making some kind of nano claim, but they don't identify which kind of nanomaterial that they're actually applying. The second largest category we have is for silver, or nano silver, and then titanium, titanium dioxide, and silver. But across the board, it's pretty much a little bit more than half of the products where there's a nano claim, the producer does not identify which material it actually is, which is kind of the starting outset for any kind of risk assessment you want to make. You need to know the identity of the material you're talking about. Along with all the information about producers, materials, etc. that we've been able to find, we've also added a nano risk categorization to all the products in our inventory. If you do a search in our inventory, you'll get to a page like this, and then in front of each product, you can actually see a short summary of what we think that the NanoRisk categorization is. It's based on some papers that we wrote with, that me and Anders Baun wrote from DTU Environment, alongside with Kjeld Alstrup Jensen from the National Research Center for the Working Environment, and that were published in 2014. So NanoRisk CAT is a simple way to communicate what we know about the hazard and the exposure potential of a given application of a nanomaterial. It's based on 5 oval dots separated by a line here. The first dot will always, or the first 3 dots always describe what we know about exposure, and the last 2 always reflect what we would know, or what we know about effects. The first dot describes what we know about the exposure to professional end users. The second one relates to consumers, and the third one relates to the environment. On the other side of the bar here, we have what we know about effects, or the effect potential for humans, and then for the environment is the third dot. So in that way, we're able to easily communicate to consumers, to others, what we believe we know. Each dot can have potentially 4 different colors. The red describes or is equal high, and then we have yellow, green, and gray describing medium, low, and unknown, respectively. When it comes to determining exposure, very often there's very, very little information made available to us by the producers of these products. So therefore, we've developed a very generic approach that enables us to determine some kind of exposure potential despite of lack of information. So the assumption here that we have is that if the nanomaterial is located in the bulk, or is located on the surface, then we would say that there's a low or a green exposure potential. And the same goes for nanoparticles that are suspended in solids. If the nanoparticles are surface bound, we'll give it a yellow dot, and if they're airborne or if they're suspended in a liquid, they will receive a red dot. So that's how we determine the exposure for the first 3. And of course, this is a very generic approach, and it's assuming that you don't have any other information available to you, which is very often the case when we try to assign these exposure potential profiles to our products. When it comes to assigning the human health color, it's a little bit more complicated, but basically you have to follow this flow chart, and that will take you through a series of questions that you have to consider. And they basically boil down to whether the nanomaterial in question is what is known as a high aspect ratio nanoparticle, whether the bulk form of the material is classified under the CLP legislation, whether the nanomaterials has been associated with acute toxicity, whether it has been associated with CMR properties, respiratory toxicity, cardiovascular disease, neurotoxicity, or whether it accumulates in the organs. When it comes to the environment, the procedure is similar. We take you through a flow chart here, a little bit more complicated than the human health one, but again, it boils down to a series of questions here, whether the bulk form of the material is classified, what the LC50 values are for the bulk and the nano form, what the half-life is, what the bioaccumulation factor is, and finally, whether the nanomaterial is dispersive, whether it has ecosystem effects, and whether the nanomaterial itself is novel. The last 3 things here are inspired by the late lessons from early warnings, the first volume, where the first lesson learned actually was to acknowledge and respond to ignorance, uncertainty, and risks in technology appraisal, actually hinting at these 3 properties as being something that you should really look into when evaluating a new technology. We tested the applicability of these guidance in a paper that we published some years ago, and we found that overall these criteria are actually quite effective in evaluating nanomaterials and are very applicable, and hence we adopted them into our approach. So over the years, when it comes to nanomaterials, there's no doubt that a lot of concern has been raised. This is just a snapshot of some of the news that I've picked up over the years, and I'm not going to take you through every single here, but I'm just going to pinpoint like some of them. Up here, there's a study where researchers find that nanotubes pose the similar effects as asbestos. There's something here about toxic socks, where they're talking about the risks of nanosilver. There's something here about inhaling nano-titanium dioxide particles that could have adverse effects on the fetus. There's something here with EFSA raising red flags about silicon dioxide safety over nanoparticles. And finally, more recent one is here where ECHA actually publicly acknowledged that it cannot verify nanomaterials are being used safely, which is also very concerning. There's been a lot of regulatory developments over the recent years, or since 2004, when it actually comes to addressing some of these concerns. And this is a slide, and I know you can't read it, but you can like extract the tendencies here. Like pretty much every year we've had since 2004, there's been a number of regulatory initiatives, either commissioning huge studies, experts' opinions from EFSA, from the cosmetics expert, etc. There's been launch of research programs. There's been numerous regulatory reviews. The third regulatory review of REACH came out just 2 weeks ago, but we've also had 2 regulatory reviews specific on nanomaterials. We've had guidance revisions in the areas of chemicals and food, and we've also had some nano-specific legal revisions implemented, for instance, in the food legislation and also in the biocidal legislation, or biocidal products legislation. And that's an example I just want to highlight here as a prime example of how regulators have so far tried to address nanomaterials. For instance, in the biocidal product regulation, it's really a pioneering piece of legislation because it's for instance, the first one to implement the Commission's definition of a nanomaterial. It's the first one to require separate dossiers for all data requirements to be prepared for the nanoform. And finally, it's the first one to require a dedicated risk assessment when a nanoform of a substance is used. So our approach through the years has been to follow the environmental health and safety literature very closely, really try to understand what makes nanomaterials different from the bulk form of the material when it comes to testing and risk assessment. And then finally, we've used that information to analyze the different pieces of legislation that we have, for instance, on chemicals, on the Water Framework Directive, and et cetera, et cetera. And the way we've looked at it pretty systematically is always regards to, are the definitions applicable? Does the tonnage requirements, do they make sense? Do the information requirements make sense? Et cetera, et cetera. The purpose has always been to provide recommendations on how challenges could be overcome. As you might know, like good recommendations have to be constructive, they have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be sensitive, and they have to be balanced. And we've really tried to, every time we've pointed out a problem, we've tried to also develop solutions. That has resulted in quite a few papers in the various areas. As I mentioned, like the Water Framework Directive, REACH, the BPI, the Biocidal Products Regulation, risk assessment, exposure assessment, release studies. There's a lot of different areas where we've really tried to look at what are the challenges, what are the weaknesses, and provide recommendations on how these can overcome. Overall, it seems it boils down to 3 overall weaknesses that the existing legislation really is challenged with. The first one is the unclear definition of nanomaterials. The second one is threshold values and information requirements not tailored to the nanoscale. And then finally, that it's really unclear how we are going to overcome the challenges that nanomaterials pose to chemical risk assessment. So if we look at, for an example, I complimented the biocidal regulation earlier for being the first to implement the European Commission's definition of a nanomaterial, and it reads as you see here. Like a nanomaterial means a natural or manufactured active substance or non-active substance containing particles in an unbound state or as an aggregate or as an agglomerate, and where for 50% or more of the particles in a number size distribution, one or more external dimensions is in the size range of 1 to 100 nanometers. So in theory, this looks like a very impressive definition, but there's a number of things that really makes you scratch your head. For instance, what does it mean with natural, and why did the Commission decide, as the only definition we have out there on nanomaterials, to include natural nanoparticles? What does it mean to be in an unbound state? Why was 50% or more chosen as the threshold value? Why was some number size distribution chosen? And why do you use such a vague formulation as in the size range of 1 to 100 nanometers? Second, when you base everything on the size distribution, then it might be beneficial that it was clear how to actually measure size. And that's not the case when it comes to nanoparticles. There's a number of different methods out there to measure nanoparticles, and they all give diverging results. Some methods will tell you that this is definitely a nanomaterial, whereas others will give conflicting answers. Here you see a summary table that the Joint Research Center did, where they investigated a range of different methods to see where their strengths and weaknesses were in regards to nanomaterials. And the overall conclusion is that the methods do not deal well with non-spherical particles, and they don't deal well with aggregates. And that's what you can see here. You can't make out the columns, but here you have the different techniques. Here you have the different properties that you would like the technique to be able to master. And then what you see here is just a lot of minuses and double minuses when it comes to non-spherical particles and aggregates. And the really tragic thing is that in reality, particles or nanoparticles are non-spherical and they aggregate. So basically what the tools we have here available to us now, they're not able to really describe reality, which is really sad. I won't take you through the second weakness, but I'll jump straight into the third one here, relating to how do we actually apply chemical risk assessment. We know that dedicated nano-specific risk assessment requires 4 different features. That you know that you have very good control on the material characterization, that you describe the exposure preparation and how you deliver the substance to the test systems, that you're able to monitor the stability and the consistency of the nanomaterials during the test, and then finally that you're able to measure a relevant dose and how you actually report different doses. The good news is that we almost know now, I would say, how to actually determine these aspects. We have in our labs, and I can't take the credit for it because I'm not a lab person, but in our labs, I would say that we're actually able to, after 10 years of research, to actually do this for some nanoparticles. The bad news is, of course, that very few actually report these elements in their scientific work or in their regulatory work. Even the OECD is having problems actually doing this, despite the fact that they actually have a whole guideline on how to do this. We don't know how to interpret all the information that we're receiving, which kind of is challenging. Like, we have so many bits of information on different particles that putting it all together and interpreting it is quite challenging. We also have problems with reproducing our findings. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have great nanomaterial variation, which makes it extremely challenging to do nanospecific risk assessments. There's been some recent developments in regards to updating the technical guidance documents that the European Chemical Agency provides to industry. And overall, I think ECHA really did a great job working with stakeholders on how to address some of these challenges. But of course, or not of course, but there are still some really nasty problems still with us. For instance, it's unclear how the different characterization methods are to be used, and how the ecotox testing is to be performed. We need more detail on how the reported data will and can actually be put together into the chemical safety assessment, and we urgently need some technical guidelines to be provided by the OECD on dissolution and aggregation. Over all of this is lingering lack of progress in updating the REACH annexes. Is these guidance documents, although I really in favor of the revisions that were made, there seemed to be a lack of a regulatory hook to really pin these guidance revisions on. And that's the really challenged by the lack of progress in regards to updating the REACH annexes, because the registrants are not legally required to provide any of this information that ECHA is calling for in their guidance documents, and that's a bit of a problem. So with that, overall, I hope that you can follow how I could come to the conclusion that based on these three overall weaknesses, we really need a new regulatory framework specific for nanomaterials. And the question is, of course, what might such a regulatory framework look like? And that's what I spent quite some time on thinking about the last 10 years. So what I drew some inspiration on was all the good aspects that are actually in the updated revisions that have been implemented, such as, for instance, the biocidal products regulation, as well as the food directives. Good aspects of the suggestions that have been made by others. For instance, I want to mention the Center for International Environmental Law, the European Environmental Bureau, and Client Earth. They published a report on the so-called nanopatch, which is quite a nice piece of work. There's also the German Federal Agency and Swedish Chemi have also proposed alternative to REACH when it comes to adaptations of REACH when it comes to nanomaterials. And all of those combined with the recommendations that we have ourselves developed over the years, I've tried to fit into an overall framework, which I've then called REACT Now. REACT Now puts the burden to prove safety on the registrant as well as importers of nanomaterials. It means that any variation in size, shape, surface treatment, etc. should be registered separately and also safety evaluated separately. I would suggest that European Chemical Agency is managing the technical and administrative aspects of this new legislation, just as they do with chemicals, just as they do with biocides. I suggest that the Joint Research Center is made responsible for providing technical assistance to small and medium-sized enterprises. And finally, which is probably key, or is key, is that only safe, effective, and necessary uses of nanomaterials are allowed to come into commerce. So that was the overall aspects of it. So if we go a little bit more in detail, the R of REACT Now stands for registration, and I would suggest that registration is required by manufacturers and importers prior to commercialization and independent of production and import volumes. Nanomaterials are to be defined according to Skinner's definition of nanomaterials, acknowledging that there's no ideal definition of a nanomaterial out there, but at least Skinner's definition has some kind of lingering back to science and the early ideas about what nanomaterials actually are, and are not completely pervaded by political interests. And I also want, as part of the registration, that the manufacturers and importers provide a justification for the functional use, the necessity, and the effectiveness of their materials. Why would you use them? I want them to really explain that as part of the registration, and if they're not, authorization to use should not be granted pretty much by default. When it comes to information requirements in REACT Now, they're mainly focused on nanomaterial identifiers such as size, shape, surface treatment, and as well as the analytical methods used to determine these properties. I want the registrant to describe nanomaterial uses and exposure potential, I want them to provide nanospecific human health hazard information as well as environmental hazard information to the extent that they need to in order to fill out the NanoRisk CAT evaluation. As soon as you have enough information to fill out the 5 dots, then you don't need to do any more testing and you don't need to do any more generation of data. As far as I'm concerned, then from a regulatory point of view, I think we have enough information to actually make a decision. The E in REACT Now stands for evaluation, and that's pretty much equal to the NanoRisk CAT framework, which I've already introduced you to here. So I won't spend much time on going much into that. Authorization is based on the categorization that you get by using the NanoRisk CAT. And overall, I think it's interesting to maybe dive into two of the categories here. What I call Category 1 nanomaterials, that's where you have combinations of red. Here I want the registrant to do an alternative assessment. I want ECHA or scientific opinion to be sought by the relevant scientific committees. And I want a 5-year authorization to be granted only if there's no safer alternatives and if the specific use has been identified and deemed necessary, efficient, and safe. On the other range, or the other side of the scale, we have what I call Category 3 and Category 4 applications. And here I think it's fair to provide or give authorization for uses where you have, for instance, a combination of green, human health, environmental hazard profile, or that you have green, human, and environmental profiles. So, of course, as you can see, the NanoRisk CAT framework plays a very central role in our in my suggested scheme. And you might ask why. Over time, we've analyzed more than 50 different alternative decision support tools, and each of them have different scopes. Each of them have pros and cons. And when it comes down to it, NanoRisk CAT was best for the purpose that we wanted it to fulfill, or I wanted it to fulfill, namely to support regulatory action. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'm happy, of course, to discuss it with you if you have specific questions that you might want to raise. One could be concerned that REACT Now might be an overreaction, and I see some of you nodding your heads here. And here I just want to highlight the fact that maybe it is, but I would say it's very, very unlikely. Because if you look at through time, overregulation is extremely rare. And we know this from the work that the European Environment Agency has published in 2001 and 2013. It's very seldom that regulators have ever over-regulated when it comes to health and safety and the environment. I would argue that REACT Now is designed to spark innovation, so even if it's over-regulation, it will spark innovation within companies and making them develop green nanomaterials or green nanomaterial applications. We very often hear the argument that there's no evidence of nanospecific harm. And here I just want to pinpoint the fact that we have concerns have been raised. And what we very often see is a long period of time where there's a lot of discussion about how serious should we actually take these concerns. And then all of a sudden, these concerns or these risks become very well established. And we know that from the case of asbestos, we know that from the case of benzene, we know it from lead in gasoline, that those very early indications of harm that were discussed widespreadly in society, and then they were quieted down, and they were smoldering for 25 years, and then they reblossomed, and then the risk became firmly established. And I would argue that we're in this 25-year period now with nanomaterials. So back to my motivational question, how do we avoid that nanomaterials become a future late lesson? My humble answer is, we react now. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And before I do that, I have to to acknowledge some people that have helped me over the years. I really like this quote by Tia Gibson, where she says, like, no matter what accomplishments you make, somebody helped you. And that's certainly been the case for me and the work that I've done relating to this doctoral thesis. First of all, I want to thank my many different co-authors. I want to thank Anders Bavn, Eika, Nana, Susanne, Torben, Jørgen, Esther, Anne-Marie, David. I want to thank the NanoRisk group that we have at our department, the environmental chemistry section, the European Environment Agency, FACES, and then finally Maria, my parents, my brother. You're very special to me, and I couldn't have done this without you. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I look very much forward to discussing my work with you. Thank you.
So we are about ready to go on with our proceedings. I've already invited Wim de Koen from the European Chemicals Agency to take the podium to lead the discussion with the candidates. So we have agreed with the opponents that Wim de Koen will lead the first part, and that Nicholas Ashford will also participate in this part, and then the two opponents will shift their place, and we will continue. And then I should inform you that I have received 2 questions from the auditorium that we will have immediately following the official opponents. So please go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this great moment. And let me also congratulate you with this impressive amount of work. We've met, of course, each other before in ECHA, Chemical Agency. And I really want to express my appreciation of the quality of your work, your involvement in ECHA's work. We have been, for the audience maybe, we have started more than 5 years ago, approximately, in a Chemicals Agency expert working group on nanomaterials. And every member state there has a seat, meaning everyone can bring an expert. And also industry and NGOs are represented. And NGOs were so clever, if I may say, to appoint you to represent them, because of course it's a specialized domain, and I really appreciate your contributions and your involvement and your energy in that, and it reflects well in an impressive number of papers. Someone told me there was a limit even of 10 years, otherwise it would have been even bigger. Thank you for sending a smaller version for traveling, and otherwise it would have been a big task to carry this. I'm of course not only here to praise you, but also to have a dialogue and to assess some of your findings and your assumptions. And maybe let's start with the beginning, from the reality. I do immensely appreciate the intellectual exercise you do by proposing a scheme. But I will, in the story of my questions, always touch back on the reality as I've witnessed them in ECHA in the last 10 years, which is, as you said in some of these press releases, is not a honeymoon and roses story for nanomaterials. As you know, the Commission always has told us that REACH holds for nanomaterials, and as you know from the nanomaterial working group, we've always tried to make REACH work. And my first question is actually going in that direction. I would like your help, right? Because until now, we've tried, if ECHA opens a dossier on a chemical and it thinks together with member states that information is missing, it has the legal authority to ask tests to be performed. So we've done that with legal creativity, with experts like you trying to derive what we call decisions that are sent to companies that force them, thou shall perform these and these and these tests. So far, we failed. We've tried several strategies, and fundamentally our starting point was Article 3 of REACH says that a registrant, so someone who manufactures or produces a chemical, is responsible for the safe use. So if we have a concern, as you've said here, on nanomaterials, we think we have a legal basis. We use Article 3 for any nanomaterial. You shall describe it at a minimum, and you shall perform these and these tests. What happens? Companies go to our Board of Appeal, which is an independent body, which can override a decision that ECHA takes together with member states. And one of their last statements was they overturned our decision, meaning we could start from scratch, saying that such a generic statement that nanomaterials are causing concern because of specific effects are not valid. We need actually specific reasons, preferably for a nanomaterial, or at least a concern that holds for all nanomaterials. And you've alluded a little bit to it to the end. So could you help me in this way of thinking induced by our Board of Appeal, given the current REACH framework? Could we derive a specific concern for nanomaterials that holds, that can be used, and said, look, we've had some evidence here and there, but what is for you, for example, a way of reasoning that could be valid enough to be used in a legal context that justifies that nanomaterials are of concern? Could you help me with that?
Yeah, I would say on top of my head, I would say any kind of respiratory exposure is associated with inflammation. And I would say that it would be one generic toxicity endpoint, I would say, is pretty consistent. Mm-hmm. As a personal rule, when journalists ask me which kinds of nanomaterials would I never use, mm-hmm. my answer has often been the ones that are airborne, yeah. where exposure leads me to inhale them. Yeah. Because I think pretty consistently across the board of materials, we've seen problems with that. Yeah. And so that would be one. And then I think maybe there's some education needed also through your Board of Appeal, because asking for one specific CHOCS endpoint to cover something like nanomaterial is pretty insane, to say the least. You would never do the same for chemicals. You would never expect all chemicals to have one significant CHOCS endpoint that all chemicals fulfill. So I think it's simply a misunderstanding. And now that it is being recorded, I also think we need to acknowledge that I think the Board of Appeal is much harder on ECHA decisions than is actually merited at this point in time, because they're so afraid of being accused of the opposite, that they're always in favor of ECHA decisions. At least that's the only way I can interpret the way that the Board of Appeal decided in these specific cases, because it makes absolutely no sense that you have a dossier that does not have nanospecific information in it, and ECHA is not equipped under REACH, which is supposed to be no data, no marketing, that you can't go back and ask for additional information. I just don't, I couldn't believe their decision.
Yeah, well, we shared the disappointment. By the way, my statements are not in the name of the agency, right? They're in my personal
You're a professor
name,
here.
right?
That's the good...
yeah, that's the nice thing about it.
Can you talk a little more into the mic?
Here? Yeah. Good. No, I share that disappointment maybe, but this is how one should respect the law, right? Of course, the Board of Appeal is one body, still the Court of Justice. But indeed, it seems that the concern that is raised, or that has been shown for certain, for example, the high aspect ratio nanomaterials, doesn't echo wide enough for all types of nanomaterials. But thank you for that. If we now move to test materials, right? Test methods, sorry. Sorry. You mentioned that they're not valid for nanomaterials, right? Sorry, great cold.
Or at least that we don't know whether they're valid.
Yeah. Nevertheless, the test method regulation is very old. Test methods have their value, Is there a way forward, you think? Because there are recently like 3 nanomaterial methods are regulated. I mean, there is the one for inhalation, 2, one for dispersion stability. Test methods are here to stay, right? Where do you expect most benefits from in the coming years at OECD test method level?
Yeah. No, I think what I agree. Test methods are definitely very important, and I actually think what we need is, of course, to begin with, follow the guidance. Second, follow the recommendations that have been developed when using the guidance in order to make it specifically relevant for nanomaterials. And then thirdly, reflect upon the applicability of the test method. And I think that's kind of what I've really been mystified with the OECD sponsorship program, is that it seems that the OECD, they actually developed the guidance prior to the program or during the program was developed. And the guidance is very good. It actually tells you what you should consider when testing a nanomaterial. But then in their own program, none of the participants actually followed that guidance.
Yeah.
And the ones that did, the very, very few, less than 1%, they never reflected upon whether the guidance, the revised guidance, were applicable to their nanomaterial. So it's really like you take a given guidance or a standard and you just use it unconsciously, and you don't reflect upon whether it's actually applicable. And I think that's really sad. So if we could just go with the first steps in this process, I think we would go a long way.
Yes. Now, we need to deal with some hazard, right? And some hazard information needs to be there. Your own NanoRisk cat is using hazard information, right? So how do you weigh then this uncertainty in your system?
I tried to, we tried to lower the values, the cutoff values, to reflect the uncertainty to some extent. So some of the values that we have in our system are deliberately set lower than they are in for regular chemicals, in order to make it be triggered faster, so to speak. But you're absolutely right. For instance, our reliance on LC50 or EC50 value, you could attack those for the same arguments that I've been attacking risk assessment, etc. But here it's just fundamental that you describe what you did and how you did it, and that you reflect upon the applicability of the methods that you used before you make your conclusions.
Do you think that the criticism that you voice on the test method, variability, etc., is it any different for other chemicals? Because basically the guidance is great, it's full of detail, everyone goes off in their own lab, performs experiments, you bring it back, and you see huge variation. Isn't that natural, or is it worse for nanomaterials?
I think it's breathtaking how complex it is for nanomaterials. I would say, like, I'm not an ecotox expert, but it seems that people are not able to recognize their test systems when they start working with nanomaterials. And we very often hear people that tell us that now they're moving into nano testing, so watch out because here they come. and we welcome them, because we have so many challenges that the more that work on addressing these, the merrier. But very often, 9 months later, these people come back and say, like, we've done this for 25 years, but the last 9 months have been so frustrating. Like, we have students, PhD students, postdocs, that are really, like, sometimes very, very frustrated with the behavior of nanoparticles in different kinds of media, at different kinds of concentrations, and so I do think it's a lot more complex than we're used to.
So how would you solve that? Because, I mean, if everyone keeps on creating their own experiments and you cannot compare even the same material, we assume they test the same material, but who knows how they've been manipulating and keeping the dose and measure the dose. Is there anything missing then?
No, I think we do have to to address it by following the guidance that are actually out there. I think that, for instance, the OECD guidance documents or the guidance that they developed in support of testing for nanomaterials, it actually makes a lot of sense, but it requires a lot of additional material characterization, characterization of how you actually did the test sampling, how you did the whole exposure studies, and I think so a lot more description about what was done and how it was done, and then some self-reflection about what the impacts were. Just reporting that you bought some nanoparticles from a company and then sonicated it and then exposed the Daphnia for 48 hours and here's the LC50 value. I don't think that's not going to cut it anymore.
No. But we do agree here that, I mean, despite your new approach, that we need these tests. We need to generate information.
Yes, for sure.
On nanomaterials.
Yes, industry needs to generate nanospecific information.
Yeah. If I then move to your preference for the Scanier definition, right?
Yes.
I was a bit kind of, not surprised. I mean, I know the Ripon-1 debate and why. Now, Scanier, the threshold is extremely low. It's 0.15%, right, of number size distribution. And I was wondering why. Why would you prefer that? You mentioned that it's scientifically more solid than the 50%. But isn't it so that the EU definition also allows you to put the 50% lower? There is a sentence in the definition that says, you don't need to stick to the 50. If you have valid reasons based on concern, you can put it lower. Okay, but fine. That's my reading.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't see it that way, but I'd like to hear from you why you prefer the Scanier definition.
Mm-hmm. No, I think the argument is that until we know what the risks are of nanomaterials in various applications, we need to have a very tight net on what nanomaterials are out there. Mm-hmm. So the broader the definition, the more we would catch. Mm-hmm. And then when we realize slowly, based on information, that this net is too tight or too fine masked, then we can broaden it. Mm-hmm. But so I wanted to catch as much as possible. Okay. That was one argument. And I noticed that was like EFSA's argument for going for 10% and not 50% was the exact same. And the second argument, or my second reason why I prefer the Scanier definition is because it has a hook in some kind of scientific evaluation. Like the European Commission asked some leading experts, some of them are actually in the room here, to come up with elements of a definition. And they actually did. And then what happened? The Commission went like this, and all of a sudden we have 50%. It's like there's a lot away from a scientific recommendation of 0.15% to 50%. And I think we kind of need to bring it back to reality. Like, why ask a scientific committee in the first place if you're going to ignore their advice afterwards? I felt that was just not right.
Well, you can say a lot on the Commission, but the Commission is usually not acting alone. And I mean, there are many different interests that could play there. I don't know, but 50 was the mark, but it could be lower, so there's something there. Yeah,
but we haven't seen anybody come up with a proposal that was lower, and some, like the biocidal products legislation or regulation, completely ignores that part of the definition. So, yeah.
Do you know the status of the review of the definition? I mean,
I just heard them present some work some years ago, but I don't know what the state is actually, and I don't know when it's expected either.
I think we all expect it, but we're still waiting, right?
Yeah.
Indeed.
But do you know where it's stranded? Is it the Commission, or is it?
I presume it's at GRC level, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are by itself, that is a big body, and not necessarily everyone is maybe on the same line.
Yeah.
Because one comment on putting it too low, just take the example in one of the debates we had, is that if a chemical is made in pellets, right, then just by the sheer manipulation, there will be always some fractions, some powderish type of material in a drum. If then majority of the particles is then in a pellet form, it risks to become a nano. So those type of maybe practical arguments became dominant in the discussion.
Yeah. I can follow that, and I think having a very tight definition of a nanomaterial would also challenge industry to actually get their processes more straight. Like we've seen examples in Denmark, for instance, where somebody realized that they were a nanomaterial due to this 50% threshold, and then they started developing their processes to get the better control of the size distribution so that they could actually get out of the nano area. So in that way, I would actually challenge industry to if you want to be in the nano area or don't want to be it, like get your methods straight so that you can actually produce them and specify what size ranges they're really in.
And in your thesis, you referred to the synthetic amorphous silica case, right, as a nice example. I mean, I can see your reasoning, but isn't it so that many of those nanomaterials, in fact, once they're in use, are really aggregating to a solid particle, right?
Yep.
So is it valid to comment on that so negatively? I mean, it's an unbound state, aggregate or agglomerate. If it's made in furnace as an unbound particle, but then starts to aggregate and agglomerate, and then becomes in the micrometer range, are we then not? Should we then not give, I mean, honesty to, I mean, our reasoning and say, look, this is then not anymore existing at that stage, or am I too easily following industry arguments here?
No, I think it's definitely an industry argument, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have merit. But what I was really surprised with in this case of amorphous silica is that the Commission has a definition that includes aggregates and agglomerates. And then they make an exception to amorphous silica with the argument that it's an agglomerate out of the nano range. So you can't have a definition that includes aggregates and agglomerate, and on the other hand say that it's not a nanomaterial because it's an agglomerate or an aggregate. So, and that's kind of like my main, like I use this case to illustrate that this is causing a lot of confusion even for the ones that developed the definition and now have to implement it. And a follow-up on that could say, like, if it's really an aggregate, and then all the tests that were done on amorphous silica in the dossier and reported, they were in theory on nano aggregates. But that argument was never presented. So in theory, you could say the whole dossier consisted of nano-tested materials, but that argument was not presented. It was only presented when it came to getting off of the nano hook in the dossier. And even they didn't even have to, I think that was it. Yeah.
I'm just continuing that reasoning. So nano, instead of becoming a marketing argument, very often becomes now something that we should not mention, right? And the reason, I mean, if you look at what from the 12 or 14,000 chemicals that have been registered in ECHA, to maybe handful are nanomaterial in the tick box and all the rest is silent. Knowing that all pigments are nanomaterials, for example, how can you break that reasoning? That's something we struggle with. Why are all pigments not stepping forward and saying we are nanos? How can you convince them, you think, with your knowledge that it's not a bad thing to be a nano? Or is there too much fear there?
No, I think they fear like the what could happen to them if they acknowledge that they're a nanomaterial, due to the uncertainties that there are at this point in time about what the potential future obligations could be. And I think that's the reason why they're not ticking the box. But there's also, like, it's not always clear how much expertise the people that do the registrations actually have. Like, we've come across dossiers where they clearly say that they're not a nanomaterial, but then when they report the size distribution, they actually use electron microscopy to count this and document the size, and it's very clear that they're definitely a nanomaterial. So it's always a little bit back and forth. But I think what a combination of make it mandatory and not voluntary to tick the box, and then providing technical assistance to companies that are challenged with this, I think is a very good combination. I don't think there's much more that ECHA can actually do than you've done. Like, you've had tons of seminars about industry having to report this. You've done a lot of outreach. I think it probably boils down to the Commission actually putting it into legislation that this has to be done.
You're currently working on it, so we'll come back to that later.
Yeah.
So if I now move to your database that you created, which is great. I mean, this morning there were 3,037. Impressive. You mentioned it in your thesis. I don't know if it was very clear in the presentation, but databases are mushrooming, right? I mean,
they're what?
Mushrooming in a way.
Yeah,
I mean, France has one, Belgium started. ECHA has an observatory, right? I know you're not very happy with that, but leave that there. Is there any possibility to merge those databases, or do you think there's too many hurdles to bring them together? Why is this happening at different speeds in different countries, while yours is clearly addressing the EU market, as you said? France is very France only, Belgium as well. How can we break this, and how can we make a bigger database?
Yeah. I think we need an EU-wide initiative, and I hate beating on the Commission all the time, but I think it needs to come from the Commission, and we have to realize a lot of these, at least the national databases, they have come out of frustration of lack of initiatives from the Commission, where, like, the French were very vocal in saying that we need a EU-wide registry. The Commission said no. The French counter-argued that we'll establish our own. And they were very vocal in the way of saying, like, we'll establish it, so that it's quite clear that it actually falls under the remit of chemical regulation. And the Commission has not, like, challenged France at the courts about this. The Danes have developed something on products, because they were more interested in products than actual substances and materials. The Belgians, and I see all of these mushrooms, at least on a national level, as an attempt to really push the Commission to develop a EU-wide registry. And industry is also now calling for an EU-wide registry, because they're sick and tired of having to live up to 15 different reporting schemes in natural territories. And then when it comes to our own work, I think this comes out of frustration with regards to continuously asking for the same data, like production volumes, market penetration of products, being able to go buy nano products that are not in any kind of inventory. And I think that's why the NGOs and we and others have also really tried to establish some kind of overview of what's there. And those can easily be merged. We recently hooked up or worked with the US EPA, where they actually said, like, can't we use this in our consumer exposure assessment somehow? And they developed some kind of program that can actually merge information from all the publicly available databases, and we support this a lot and gave them access to the whole to all the codes of our database in order to really support this. But it doesn't come from Europe; it comes from the Americans. which is kind of interesting.
It's absolutely interesting. So we should talk ECHA and your database to make it more linked, I think. In terms of curation, I mean, you said you don't anyone that submits anything in that database, you leave as such. You don't touch. Yesterday I was Googling, I was going through a bit, there were like toys that had the Nano name, but could very well be that there's nothing Nano inside, right?
For sure.
Okay.
For sure.
Okay.
And I think that we could start off by weeding out all of those, right?
Yeah.
Like if you can't just be Nano by name.
No.
Like calling yourself Nano has to come with a responsibility.
Yeah.
And first one is that you actually document or explain whether you're Nano.
Yeah.
I know that, of course, you can be small and then it's fashionable to call yourself Nano, but we just didn't know how to draw the line, and we still don't really do.
No,
like you can have the Nano iPhone,
Yeah, exactly. No,
which actually has Nano wiring in it. So
Yeah.
in that sense, it's definitely something that we would, in
Yeah.
some circumstances, call nanotechnology.
Yeah.
And you can have these gadgets, but it just helps muddy the waters. And I think React Now really tries to create some clarity in regards to what's out there.
When you published the database and it also had the NanoRisk cat colors on it, what was industry's reaction? I'm curious. I mean, how did they respond?
There's been very few reactions actually, but I have very few. Yeah, but I have represented in the UK, where one industry representative called it very, very dangerous.
Dangerous.
But I haven't heard from him for 5 years, so I don't know
very dangerous.
Yeah. And then we did a mistake where we put a wrong NanoRisk cat profile to a product where it should have been elsewhere. And there it was a German product producer that then contacted us and said, like, this does not seem right. And we looked into it and we changed it, and that's been kind of the few reactions that I've had from industry on this.
Okay.
I don't know if it's just like if they some kind of silent treatment, like if they don't acknowledge it's there, then there won't be much attention to it.
Because looking at it in more detail, it's a very, you aggregate a lot in one color, basically, right? If you take the hazard, you take as well bulk-related toxicology or ecotox information. For example, one LC50 value below 10 milligrams per liter is sufficient to have a hit. In an ecotoxicological way of thinking, is that fair, or why is there no? Have you considered ways of weighing for example, the different toxicology information, because it's kind of a very much yes/no type of decision tree.
Yeah, it is. There's elements of the framework that requires a more holistic assessment, especially when it comes to human health. There's a number of criteria that we ask people to consider where we're not able to have thresholds with cardiovascular disease, neurotoxicity, and so on. But you're right. Like, I think what we looked into, like the current threshold values under, for instance, the PPT criteria, and simply like, did they make sense to have these thresholds? And then we were inspired by those and implemented those in our system. But of course, in theory, there's no problem with you following the framework and then arguing your way around it, so to speak, with scientific arguments, saying like this is maybe we have an EC50 value that's higher than 10 milligrams per liter, but therefore we believe that, because that's also part of the process. And I think that's perfectly fine. And then you can go into dialogue with stakeholders, with regulators about whether we actually believe that's true or not. But weighing up against each other is dangerous.
I know. So if I rephrase it, maybe then the NanoRisk cat is a tool for communication, for dialogue, more than with with well, they're not a registrant. I mean, you put in the data, or do they put in the data themselves?
No, we put in the data.
put in the-
Yeah, and we do the NanoRisk
Yeah.
CAT evaluation. We've had no contact with
No
any
contact at
industry
all. Yeah.
related to the nano database and the data that we put in. It's on our website that if industry has information that we have not included, especially on exposure actually,
Exactly.
then we would be happy to receive that information and adapt our profile. NanoRisk CAT was originally developed to screen applications of nanomaterials and communicate what we knew about exposure potential and hazard potential.
Okay.
But then in the NanoRisk CAT framework, I've pretty much made it the engine for deciding whether you have to or can be granted authorization to use or should not be granted authorization. So it does, React now takes it to a different level than it was originally developed to actually facilitate.
You used the word just a holistic assessment, and I also took note of that. I mean, how should I see that holistic assessment? Because I mean, dealing with REACH for so many years, is this like an expert judgment, or because then you get into muddy waters, right? I mean, at least that's my experience.
Yeah, but for sure, no, but it is meant to be expert judgment.
Okay.
And it is expert. Like NanoRisk CAT is not developed for your average consumer to use. It is you need expert knowledge.
Yeah.
And what in a holistic assessment of cardiovascular disease, neurotoxicity, etc., what we would ask people to do is to go through the literature and provide their assessment of what the literature says in regards to these specific areas of concern. And then, of course, as with any scientific judgment, that would then be subject to scrutiny by ECHA in this case, if it's React Now, or other scientists in the scientific literature and so on. But it's basically, you could argue that people should follow the weight of evidence guidance that you guys have for regular chemicals. It is a holistic assessment where we ask people to do a literature review, document the literature review, and explain.
Yeah. Has it been ever considered to go through an exercise like that? I mean, it was funded by the
Danish EPA funded it originally. Yeah, we did. In the annexes of the original report, there's free, very detailed applications where we go through the whole analysis. And then in the article that we published, there's 8 examples of where we go through the literature on 8 different applications of.
Yeah, because it would be worthwhile to spread this more, and if you're finding disagreements, either to produce some guidance or some material that would help, because in the human health aspect you come up with pretty, how would I say, REACH type of exotic endpoints. I mean, neurotoxicity, cardiovascular. How are you going to get that type of information in terms of toxicological information? Do you encounter those data often?
No, I don't encounter them often, but it's but we did find them if you simply do a literature search, and you have nanoparticles that have been associated with it, and it's for me, it was not necessarily important that we were able to find them now being associated with these adverse effects, but we want to keep track of them, and so. When we see that there are studies associating nanoparticles with cardiovascular disease, we don't want to ignore that when we build a regulatory system that's supposed to generate data for us to be able to, in the future, make smart decisions.
It's more the framework you put up for the future. If we now move to your React Now, there's no tonnage trigger, right?
No.
Why is that?
That's because I think it was very arbitrary to actually put a certain value up there. And then the second one was that to really make sure that if you commercialize it, then you have to live up to the registration requirements to create, to eliminate the loopholes that there might be by setting a mass or a specific surface area based threshold that I couldn't really defend. So it said, okay, let's get rid of that and say, like, if you're a nanomaterial, you have to register. If you're a pharmaceutical, you have to register. If you're a biocide, you have to register. If you're a pesticide, you have to register. It's independent about whether you sell it to your grandmother or not, right? It's a pharmaceutical, right? And in this case, I wanted to kind of set the same scene for nanomaterials.
Yeah, you don't make any exclusion for R&D stage material? Like
yes, no. I do.
Okay.
As always, there's some exclusion for that.
Okay. And if you then go further, you say that any difference in any of the characterizers makes it a new nanomaterial, right? So that's gonna inflate tremendously the volume, because there are sometimes differences between batches of nanomaterials. I mean, that's from experience. Would that then be different nanomaterials?
Yeah, I think for sure, if you're very strict on my recommendation, it would make each batch different. But on the other hand, that might also help or challenge industry to get better control of how they produce the different batches, so that you don't have differences in the different batches. And the other point that I think is important to, I forgot what it was. Yeah, I lost it. I forgot.
It'll come back for sure. No, let's continue on the next step then. So you have no tonnage trigger. Any variation leads to a new.
Now I have it. Okay. It also means that industry won't commercialize everything. They will be challenged to be able to reproduce the exact same particles pretty much in every batch, and make sure that they have those processes under control before they're commercialized, which means that not all nanoparticles will be commercially available. For instance, if you look at titanium dioxide, at the moment some companies have 300 different grades of titanium dioxide, and if you look at how these grades are described, it's actually exactly what I'm suggesting. They vary in regards to size, shape, surface treatment. So it's actually nothing more than just registering each different grade. And if we have like nanomaterials supposed to be the third industrial revolution, like how can we expect that there will only be 28 different forms? Like, I don't think we should shy away from the fact that we will need 20,000 registrations of nanomaterials in the future. And that's kind of what React Now is also trying to argue, is that
I can follow you, but then I come to, I'd say, probably the most contentious part of your way of thinking is you actually prescribe a kind of pre-authorization system, right? And then, I mean, on page 109 and 10, you describe, is there a reasonable functional use and a technological need, right? And is the use for which authorization is sought usable and effective? Then I had to swallow and read again, like, really? I mean, in all realism, I mean, how do you think for nanomaterials, which, okay, I can see your reasoning, it's considered in the food regulation, but food has a specific scope, right? Food, we all can define that. Biocide is made to kill, also has a specific scope. But all others, like industrial chemicals, I would say chemicals that are not designed to kill, how I would explain them, you're going to assess that they have a reasonable functional use and a technological need. Convince me that this is how you're going to do this and that it is workable, because I have questions on that.
Yeah. No, I think we have a lot of experience with actually explaining what the functional use are, and you mentioned them yourself, like with additives to food, for instance, like EFSA actually, or the European Food Agency, requires you to explain why are you adding this to our food.
Yeah.
And I think
But
we could also...
I mean, what I wanted to say, with food, it has a defined scope. With biocides, a defined scope. Are you going to ask for any industrial chemical or any industrial application? The effect, I mean, the usefulness. That's where I'm.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the first thing that it will do is I will ask you, if you're the producer, the manufacturer, importer, I'll ask you to explain it to me. And I think in that process, if it's a useless application, you will have a hard time defending it. And it will be obvious to anybody that reads it that this is just bogus. And I think in that process, people will actually themselves weed out these useless applications. And I agree, like, is it truly necessary to use this? I think for a lot of the products that we have in our nano database, there's a glaring yes. It's completely useless to add nanomaterials to these applications. There's at least safe, well-known alternatives out there that we use every day. But of course, like, if we really want to have these cases where there's a lot of nuances in, then you need to work further on how do you actually define this necessity. And
let's reason through some numbers here. I checked the French registry. Yesterday there was, in the latest numbers I could find, okay, they're 2016, there are approximately 13,300 declarations. So French-based manufacturers producing over 100 grams nanomaterial, right? If you extrapolate that for Europe, let's say 110,000, just as a number. How do you envisage that such a use, which probably needs to be described? I mean, I know the use descriptors under REACH. I don't know how you're gonna use the use descriptors under REACH. I can't figure that this is gonna work from an implementation point of view. Have you calculated through those numbers, or have you foreseen that in
No, I haven't done any calculations through those numbers.
Yeah.
But of course, I don't expect React Now to be implemented over the course of a week or so. Like, if we look at the implementation of REACH, that also took some time, and it also took 20,000 pages of technical guidance documents to guide industry through the muddy waters of REACH. And we're still not there. So I don't think that it's quite, I think there's at least some time that we can use to develop this further. But I still think, like, it should be pretty basic for industry to argue why is this necessary and why is this effective. And if they can't, then don't use the nanomaterial. Go back to chemical regulation.
But my reasoning would be you would need to give some legal certainty to operators in the single market, right? We are 27 member states trying to get one common market. You would need to give some instructions, methodologies. I mean, you cannot just say, convince me that it's useful. No, I mean, there is where I'm struggling with the concept. How are you going to explain in a scientific, rational way that there are criteria to say this is useful, this is not? Otherwise, you will, if you want to implement it, and I know you can't do this in a week, let's dream together in 10 years maybe, we will have to establish criteria for that.
But I mean, of course, I'm going through all the arguments that I might have, and I just realized that you actually do the same when you look at substances of very high concern. Like, you require industry to do an alternative assessment. Like, the first point of any good alternative assessment is actually explaining the functional use. And we looked into a master student that we have. She looked into a lot of these alternative assessments, and that's actually one of the caveats with many of these, is that industry forgets to explain why it's actually used. But some of them are really good at explaining it. So I don't think that will be the most new radical element of React Now that industry actually has to explain, because they actually do this for substances of very high concern.
So
already.
then basically you refer to the socioeconomic assessments that the SEAC is doing.
Yeah, I'm referring to the alternative assessment. It's part of both the socioeconomic as well as the risk assessment.
Yeah, I come back on this
When you
alternative
reach that
assessment.
level of,
I find that fascinating. Yeah, if time allows, not that much anymore. Just to reason further, then, I mean, we know REACH was also there to substitute chemicals, to stimulate innovation, and we've got, I mean, 2 weeks ago, second review is out. We're not doing so great there, right? How do you think your approach will be perceived? And I mean, if I want to think along with you, can you build arguments for industry, because they're your biggest stakeholder and adversary, I mean, at the same time, not to be immediately blamed like you are going to stifle the innovation of the key enabling technology in Europe, right? Because this is what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
How would you argue against that?
Yeah. I think we have to realize that it's a backbone reaction that you get from many stakeholders, that you'll hurt job creation and that you'll stifle innovation. But I do think that historically, and actually Nicholas Ashford, who is on the panel, has shown this in his research back in the day, that regulation can spark innovation within companies, new moving companies. It won't necessarily spark innovation within the establishment. But it will, if you set a sunset date on chemicals that you do not want in commerce, there will be small, medium-sized enterprises that seeks the opportunity and create first mover innovation endeavors.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we really need to make benefit of.
I wish it was like that. I mean, if I've seen the progress we made in REACH, yes, by identifying substances of very high concern and putting them on the candidate list, you see that people move away from that. IKEA, H&M, the big ones, they have the reaction. Now, if you probe a bit deeper and see, is REACH is often seen as just like an accountant necessity, you know, I fulfill my registration, leave me alone now, I'm on the market. But we try to convince chemical companies to say, hey, you've invested a lot of money in all these tests. What are you doing with it? Are you using this to your competitive advantage? Do you think actually it's a business asset? We've done studies last year only in some niche companies, like in bioscience, right? You find companies that really think, wow, you know, this is, because I work with safer chemicals, this is an asset. For many big companies, unfortunately, even the ones that have corporate social responsibility schemes, etc., it's a letter that is filled in, and you know, it gets blurred. Safe chemicals, yeah, of course we're compliant. So there are a lot of exercise we still need to be made.
But I think there's people here in this room that would argue that the problem is that REACH is based on a very sequential approach, where you first do your risk assessment, and then you do your risk management, and then you look for alternatives.
Not necessarily. You don't need to do all that.
But I'm saying that there are people in this room that would argue it. I'm not saying that I'm necessarily arguing it.
I'm also not.
But if you flip that on top and say, like, people have to much earlier in the process look at alternative assessment and technological options, then you're off to a better start.
Let's move maybe quickly to alternative assessment before my time's up. In a way, I read, and you refer to interesting papers, probably the authors are in the room here. The alternative assessment for nanomaterials, I like it as an idea, but again, you need data for that, right? You need hazard data. In one of these papers, you refer to high throughput testing as an option. Now, you get me excited about testing in high throughput. But then I was thinking, what are you talking about? What high throughput testing do you do with these nanomaterials? You said it earlier that dosing them, you know, in microteter plates or like that. Good luck. I mean, how realistic should I see that?
You should see it as an attempt to point into the future. of where we might be going with alternative assessment. And I think with the article, like it seems so straightforward to begin with, that of course we have alternative assessment, which a lot of people are talking about in Europe these days, and we knew people in the U.S. that have worked with alternative assessment a long time, and we said, like, okay, how do we apply this to nanomaterials? And then, of course, we ran into one challenge after the other,
Of course.
we tried to weave our way around this. But I think that the high throughput testing might be needed if you want to go through a lot of different alternatives, and I think ECHA probably, for regular chemicals, should also start updating their guidance on this.
Yes, how much time do we have to discuss this? I mean, high throughput testing, mamma mia, you'll have a, it's not a can of worms, but you open difficulties in the testing by itself, interpretation, how you're going to aggregate. I mean, there's so many projects that have, just crashed because there's so much information, and which endpoint is more important than the other is going to be a challenge. But I believe in them, don't get me wrong. The same with intrinsic exposure potential, you say. There I was a bit, on one hand, well, not surprised. I can see why you use the airborne and the water solution as red. It's kind of a precautionary one. But then I was thinking, can't you just restrict it currently? I mean, with the current tools that you have, let's just ban the use of nanomaterials, airborne, and just reasoning further how you write. Those in solution and those in airborne applications, no more.
But I think you have to see it as a process. From where do we go from having little or next to nothing known about the nanomaterial to implementing restrictions? And there's a series of processes or steps that React Now takes you through now, and enables you in the end to decide whether you want to provide or give authorization or not. And I think, of course, you can just subconvene these steps and say, let's flat out ban it. But then it's not like clear how you came from the unknown particle in this product to that kind of restriction. And I think React Now really takes you through these steps and tells you, like, if you have this combination of nano-risk cat colors, then you should consider giving a 3-year authorization, requiring industry to provide this specific data. And because you could, of course, always flat out ban it.
I have only that much time. I'll
give you
questions.
permission.
No. I'll just to think you through, because there's a lot of elegance in what you develop in React Now. My reality check is, scratching my head based on the current reality that we're in daily. The current climate, let's put it that way, is maybe not as supportive for new regulations. The Juncker Commission is clearly there to get priority on jobs and economy. Fine, we come from a very heavy financial crisis, so in political priorities, this is where we are. Where do you think which steps would you like to take to get this idea to the next level? Because, I mean, you've done all that work, and only recently this was published. Either you have this very well planned, and then
reaching out to people that have an influence on how we regulate chemicals and nanomaterials in the future, and also, I think, presenting them this work as that there is an alternative to just accepting that REACH is the most appropriate scheme when it comes to nanomaterials. Like showing that there's an alternative, I really hope will maybe bring some inspiration out. And then of course I'm hoping to strike gold, right? I'm hoping that there will be this one person that sees the light at a certain level somewhere and is able to take it through. And we have seen it happen. It has happened to some of our work in the past. Like, we were some of the first to say, like, you have to get rid of the exemptions of graphite under REACH, because then all nanomaterials carbon-based would just be exempted by default.
Yeah.
And we mentioned this at a couple of meetings, published in a paper, and then all of a sudden, the Commission deleted graphite from the list of exemptions. And we don't know why it happened, but we're quite sure that we were the first one to actually make the argument. And of course, I'm hoping that the exact same will happen at some point, that Juncker will wake up and say, I got to react now.
I got to react now. One, maybe from my perspective, I would maybe just advise you come up with a different paradigm, right? And risk assessment is so ingrained into the system, right? You're either alone in the desert, and it can happen that you meet someone in the desert that say, hey, I react now. Mm-hmm. But another way would be to say this is complementary to what you do, and see where it hooks into the existing instruments of REACH, even if you don't like it, registration. Mm-hmm. Okay, last deadline is soon over and we missed the nanomaterials.
Yeah.
Really, I still don't sleep well from that,
yeah.
But that's reality. Evaluation is there. Authorization restriction is there, but maybe the thinking can be more fit into the current tools and saying, you know, it's all not good. Let's take the React Now. Mm. So a mix between REACH Now and React Now would be, I mean,
yeah.
Mix between REACH and React Now would be REACH Now. So
yeah.
Make that compromise.
Yeah.
And with that, I will leave it in my already went over time. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Then I would like to call Professor Nicholas Ashford to the podium and make a shift between the two opponents.
Yes, thank you very much.
I don't think so.
Sorry?
Do you need a break?
No, I don't need a break. No. Nope. I'm having the time of my life, right? I know. Yeah.
First, let me say that I'm honored to be here, and I came all the way from Boston just for this event because I think it's part of my professional dues. Also, want to say that I think Wim asked many of the questions that I would ask, and so I'm not going to repeat those. I may take less than my 45 minutes, but the questions may be harder. First of all, let me say that I have not come from the United States to tell you that we do it better, so you can relax, right? Not only do we not do it better, but the so-called TSCA reform has really ossified our attempt to deal with industrial chemicals in a way which is unfortunate. The rhetorical questions whether REACH has moved sufficiently away from the TSCA model or can be made to move sufficiently away to really address industrial chemicals in a serious way. As Stefan knows, I first proposed technology options analysis in 1980. When I did some work for the U.S. Council on Environmental Quality, which is headed by the environmental advisor to the president, which there is none at this point, right? Which may be good. But my disagreement with the approach and regulation generally, air, water, and industrial chemicals, and you referred to this, is that it's a two-step system. First, you make a risk assessment, and then when you're as complete as you think you need to be, you engage in risk management decisions. I think that is an inherently faulty system, and the REACH system does borrow the idea of technology options or alternatives analysis at the end of the process rather than early in the process. And as you've documented really nicely, you need to introduce the idea of necessity, which invites alternatives analysis before you spend an enormous amount of money and time characterizing the risk. I think this is a faulty approach. Let me say that I have not come to tell you to try to influence you about the American way, but I can't resist pointing out that there are more lobbyists from the U.S. chemical industry in Brussels than there are in Washington. That's a serious problem. Okay. The old idea about comparing the absence of evidence from the evidence of absence lurks behind all of this business. If you don't have evidence, and you cited correctly, no evidence, no market. But what seems to occur in practice in Europe is no evidence, no regulation. And that's what we have to try to cure. And that's what you've gone a long way introducing the alternatives analysis early in the process. Now, if I was listening carefully and I didn't hear everything, I don't know if I ever heard you mention today the precautionary principle. But I know you know what that is. And I know David G. knows what it is. And I know we believe that if you don't have evidence, that maybe you not to allow things on the market. So I have to come at some point to actual questions. I understand. Here's a generic question. Is REACH capable, as written, of bringing technology options early enough in the process to stop the introduction of materials of which we know damn little?
No.
So what would it take?
That the question is asked to begin with. I think REACH does not even ask the question to begin with. It asks for identification of the substance. It asks you to provide some specific health and safety data. Depending on the tonnage, the information requirements vary. And very, very long into the process, do you have that requirement to actually document? And then you're already classified as a substance of very high concern, where then for given applications, you then have to answer some of these questions. And then what we've shown or what we've seen is that very seldom do companies actually do this, despite the fact that the guidance tells them to do it. So you would really have to reorganize a lot of the elements of REACH in order to address the...
Reorganize or re-legislate?
You have to re-legislate or...
Well, do you have to reorganize? You can sort of move things around, or is new legislation actually needed?
I think it might be easier to just do new legislation, I think, because opening REACH and trying to figure out how to reorganize it would be very, very challenging, I think. But it's the whole focus of REACH that you would have to change. It's the opening paragraph of what the intentions are, except for protecting the public and the environment. Everything else you would have to rewrite.
Did it surprise you that with the passage of REACH, the U.S. response in TSCA was just to keep the old models of risk assessment first and then finally get around to risk management? I mean, the Environmental Defense Fund, which is generally pro-environment, were blind and deaf to the criticisms that this approach is pretty much intellectually bankrupt. I mean, did it surprise you that TSCA, when they had a chance to reform the legislation 40 years later, didn't do anything different? I mean, it really didn't do anything different. In fact, I'll let you answer, but in fact, the priorities of what to test now has to be dictated by industry over the agency's judgment.
Yeah, but I always try to, when I visit other countries, to not pass judgment on how their system works. But I do think that I've observed the development around TSCA as being very interesting, and the discussions, and you have to wonder why so little progress has been made on many of the areas that made a lot of people call for revisions of TSCA. And I don't know, there's a lot of lobbyism going on in the U.S., and there's a lot of
I think it's a
funding
mental model that we just can't get rid of. Risk assessment first, followed by risk management. Sounds so wonderfully easy. It's very difficult.
Yeah, but I think, what about, like, you have states like California and Massachusetts that do seem to have a different approach, and it's my impression that the reason why we have so many U.S. lobbyists in Europe is because they actually want to avoid that states like Massachusetts and California start operating according to REACH to be able to sell their chemicals to Europe.
Well, we all know that they're communist states, so... And we're looking to Canada to join with the maritime provinces. Are you aware of the recent, and it's not too recent, following the scientific discoveries? One is that the combustion products from diesels have been associated statistically with increases in Alzheimer's.
I knew that ultrafine particle pollution has been associated with Alzheimer's. Yes, I knew that. Yep.
Yeah, and the recent work shows that combustion ones from diesels are specific. That is, these substances. Are you conscious of the fact that people with Alzheimer's have much more porous blood-brain barriers?
No, I wasn't aware of that. No.
Yeah, and that's in the literature too.
Yeah.
I'm not challenging you because I thought you think you should know that. But I'm just going to ask a very simple question. And I presented this to Bjorn, who now is the head of ECHA. And I'm known for not being terribly polite at times. But if you don't know, if you know what you know about these things, which I just shared with you, why isn't a very simple approach simply to say all things which cross the blood-brain barrier are automatically chemicals of very high concern? Period. Not because we know the data is there, but because there's so many examples of really disastrous effects. Shouldn't you treat them all as chemicals of very high concern if they cross the blood-brain barrier, and as a matter of policy require the shift of the burden of proof of safety onto the... I mean, why do you need a new regulation? Why do you, I mean, just simply activate that term. Chemicals of very high concern require the burden shifting. Isn't that what's in REACH?
It is.
So why do you need anything more than that?
I think the argument might be that we don't know if they cause harm, if they cross the blood-brain barrier. We have examples for history of some very nasty compounds that did cross the blood-brain barrier and cause damage. But I don't think we know whether in itself crossing that barrier is associated with harm.
Don't confuse the absence of evidence with the absence of the evidence of absence. Is there anything which crosses the blood-brain barrier that we know is not harmful?
Glucose. Glucose.
Glucose. Are you sure?
At least according to my knowledge, the brain needs some sugar once in a while, but maybe that's just a saying.
How much sugar?
Yeah.
I mean, as a matter of fact, for your information, the recent evidence shows that sugar might be a major cause of inflammation throughout the body, including the brain.
But what about the placenta? Should we also do the same with the placenta?
What about the placenta?
If it crosses the placenta to
Well,
the
the
unborn
blood-
child,
the blood of the
then
child.
should we then
Don't
say
you-
that then it's a substance of
You
very high
need to
concern?
evoke the placenta. The mother and the baby share the same blood system. And by the way, in vitro mutations and birth defects are known. We know from endocrine disruption that there's an enormous amount of harm that can occur between mother and fetus. I mean, isn't that what a lot of endocrine disruption is concerned? And epigenetic effects. I mean, I'm going to bring forward the precautionary principle a second time. What is the most prudent thing to do with substances of which you do not have evidence of their safety?
Stop using them.
Or shift the burden. You can be kinder and shift the burden. Now, okay, let me tell you, and this is a bit personal, not to my person, but my knowledge, but what I think is missing in the characterization of nanoparticles is a knowledge of surface chemistry. I'm trained as a PhD chemist. I learned about surface chemistry when I developed the paint system for the Apollo mission. It was the one that did not fall off the spaceship. It was not Apollo 13. And surfaces of small particles are unbelievably important. Let me just stop a second to tell you, and I make it a point, that I was working on the paint system, and then I was having lunch with people from the biology research group at the Illinois Institute of Technology Research Institute, and they were coating zinc oxide particles, zinc oxide, titanium dioxide, right? These are allied. Coating zinc oxide particles with benzopyrene. Now, benzopyrene is the known active carcinogen in cigarettes. And the guy who was running the experiments, he'd put different amounts of benzopyrene on the zinc oxide. He could not get a dose-response relationship. I mean, he knew that benzopyrene caused cancer because you paint the back of mice with benzopyrene and you get tumors. But how is it that he was coating particles with different amounts of benzopyrene, doing the aliquot analysis, finding no dose-response curve? So I said to him, where are you getting your zinc oxide? Oh, from various sources. I said, wait a minute. Depending upon how you make the substrate will change the amount of oxygen species and activation energy of carcinogens on the surface of the particle. Get your zinc oxide from one source. He did it, and of course he got a dose-response relationship. Because what's on the surface of the particle, whether intentionally placed or the result of adsorbed oxygen species, changes dramatically the surface chemistry. Why do I bother to tell you all this? Do you know how much work has to be done to characterize a nanoparticle in terms of its surface chemistry? Now, which is, by the way, very interesting, because if one is allowed to market it before the research is done, there won't be many marketing. If you're allowed to use it until an academic lab demonstrates that there's a problem, it will take decades before you can suitably characterize the surface chemistry that is relevant to disease causation. And I'll make a quick comment, and that is, for years, the relationship between silica dust from sandblasting and other things and cancer in silica workers, they could never get studies which always demonstrated the relationship. And that's because the silica was prepared in a different way. And now we have a regulation in the Department of Labor. Silica is recognized a carcinogen as bad as asbestos is. So the science is complicated. And by the way, I think your work is fabulous. And I think the fact that the university has been with you and sponsored this research, beyond my wildest dreams, because in 1980, when I advocated that technology options be brought, I never dreamed in my lifetime I would see it, but I've seen it. And it's like the farmer who was asked if he believed in baptism. He said, "Do you believe in baptism?" The farmer said, "Believe in it? I've even seen it done." So, you know, but we have to move beyond belief. Okay. You mentioned the control of manufacturing. It's going to take very special talent to prepare surfaces which are identical and which have on them observed species. So I come back to a very simple thing. My now having told you this, some of which you knew, some of which you didn't, why not just say that nanoparticles are substances of very high concern, and you don't allow them on the market unless you demonstrate that they're safe? Now, it's nice, and I've also recommended that you look to see if they're necessary, because if there's a very much safer way to perform the purpose, the commercial purpose, then you can hope that the political system would say, well, do that instead. But I'm not sure that necessity, and are you sure that necessity is a allowed component of risk assessment under REACH? It's not, is it?
No.
They'd have to amend it.
Yep.
They'd have to amend it. I think it's a very sensible approach. If there's something safer out there, what the hell? Don't spend millions of dollars, or $8 million or $5 million doing an animal feeding study. Go to the alternative. But we need an awakening, and I think your work will bring that awakening to the fact that you don't want to be down a rabbit hole in developing the science which will be necessary to really understand. Reserve our scientific resources for things that really have important and immediate impact, of which there are a lot of candidates. By the way, we didn't need nanotechnology to invoke a technology options analysis. It could apply to vinyl chloride plastics. It could apply to any bulk chemical. Because the truth of the matter is that we don't have an innovation deficit in the use of chemicals. We have a deployment deficit because the incumbents control the name of the song. What nanoparticles, here's a question, that are in use would fail your test right now? Of the ones that you list, the 3,000,
Yep.
which ones would fail the test? I mean, no more research.
Yeah, sun lotion that apply titanium dioxide and have a spray pump to put it on your skin. They would fail.
What about cosmetics?
They would also fail, yep. Some of them. The ones that use carbon nanotubes, titanium dioxide, yep, they would fail.
So just, I mean, this is not holding you to it, but of the 3,000 products that are out there, what would fail tomorrow if ECHA really did its job?
All the ones that have unknown materials applied in their products, and all the ones that, there's probably just one or two that wouldn't fail.
So you're talking about 2,900 would fail.
Yep.
My friends, we got a problem. We got a problem. We're standing, you know, with the elephant in the room. He's stepping on our toes and our hands and not allowing us to move, right? And hopefully this good work will do something which will move us in that direction. Do you see any differences, this is an unfair question, with the way we're approaching this problem in the U.S. and the way you're approaching it, in fact, in practice? I mean, I know your work has not been done in the United States and is not appreciated, although I'll do my best to.
Yeah. So I do see one fundamental difference, and I haven't really been able to understand the implications of it, but the US FDA has shied away from adopting a nanomaterial definition based on particle size distribution. So the definition in the US that it has to be nanoscale, which means below 1,000 nanometers, and it has the nanoparticle or the material has to have unique properties due to the nanoscale. So they have this dual definition that we also used to work with until the commission came up with their recommended definition. So this thing about being nanoscale and having these unique properties without specifying what these unique properties might be, I think that's a fundamentally different starting point. But other than that, I don't really know what is going on in the U.S.
Or I can tell you
Nothing. Or yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
now you could replace. I mean, after all, nanotechnology is simply a dimension. What I mean, recognizing that the surface to volume ratio changes dramatically with particle size. Who cares whether it's 10 nanometers or a tenth of a nanometer, except for the magnitude of the effect? When we made the pigment for the Apollo mission, what was really important was the defects in the pigment, because defects absorb energy and the spaceship would have to be brought back, which is what happened to Apollo 13. If you can produce, and by the way, we were using electron spin resonance and techniques that chemists do not use to characterize the surface chemistry. You'd have to start educating chemists in a very different dimension. ECA would have to hire some people who knew something about surface chemistry by training, not by absorption. Right? What is an expert? Somebody who's either 50 kilometers from home or 50 kilometers from the agency. Either one. So the analytical methods that have to be determined, right, are very substantial. Now suppose we agreed after we all have all this interesting, terribly interesting discussion that actually regulation isn't going to work. This is not a question from your thesis. Cass Sunstein, who used to head the regulatory review process for President Obama, has suggested this process of nudging that is depending upon how you ask individuals to understand their behavior, you get a different answer. For example, and we've addressed this with GMOs, we've addressed it with endocrine disruption, which do you think would be more effective? A label on a product that says, this does not contain nanoparticles, or a label that says, this contains nanoparticles? In which case would you get more responsive public response? I mean, do they even know what a nanocolor particle is? But if you put a label and you say it does contain or it doesn't contain, do you think it would be different than GMOs? Because in Europe, if you put this does not contain GMOs, you get a different response than you say this does contain GMOs. Different people would buy or not buy the product.
I do think there would be a difference, and the difference would be like this contains nanomaterials would of course be the one that attracts the most attention, but I'm not sure that it would be necessarily for the negative. And that's the pretty interesting thing about nanotechnology and nanomaterials is that the people in general, and me personally as well, like it's pretty cool. There's something there worth fighting for. Like GM in food, like that to me was just like something that why take the risk when I can have food that is without GM? But with nanotechnology, it offers stuff, lighter materials, stronger materials, better diagnostics, etc., that we can't do without nanomaterials, without nanotechnology. And I think that's really worth fighting for. And that's also why what I want out of the market is all the slackers that just use the nano word to gain a quick profit. I want to create a market where nanomaterials are commercialized because they actually do something and they're valuable to society. And so that we also protect nanomaterials from from the whole adventure from backfiring at us. Because we had a few scares, like with NanoMagic in Germany. There's been some other cases where people got hurt from using a product that had nano in the label or on the label, but had nothing to do with nanotechnology. And these small stories help give nanotechnology, nanomaterials a bad name. And we can't afford that to happen with a technology that offers such unique benefits.
So you wouldn't be surprised if the industry supported a label that said, this contains nanotechnology! Exclamation point. And would it help you?
You know what? We've actually had it's a little bit of a sad story, but we've had examples of people telling us, the more fuss you make about the risks of nanomaterials, the more visits I have to my website. And when people come to my website, they see how cool our products are, and the more profit we actually make. The sad thing is that the guy turned out to be one of these people that just empty companies for value. So kind of a little bit of a sad story, but still, that's what he argued. Like, bad publicity was good for his making profit.
Do you know what the Greek word nanos means?
A dwarf.
A dwarf,
yep.
A midget. So if you said this product contains midgets,
yeah.
probably wouldn't be as successful.
Yeah.
I actually have no more questions, but I want to congratulate you for doing a wonderful piece of work to review the university, for sponsoring and proliferating this work, and I look for great things to come.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for taking the time.
So thank you, Professor Ashford. So as I announced, I had 2 questions ex auditorio. And the first question is from David G., who was the originator of the project Late Lessons from Early Warnings that we already heard about. So please.
Yes, and congratulations on the amazing piece of work, Stefan. It's been a great pleasure to work alongside you for many years, and I think you're going to change the world for the better with this piece of work, really. 2 questions. 2 questions, both taken from your 25 articles buried deep in the thesis there. You demonstrate very clearly that there is a complete absence of knowledge in this field. Lots of uncertainties, lots of data gaps, lots of recognized ignorance, lots of unrecognized ignorance. And yet, when you looked at the last 20 years' worth of EU research funding of nanotech and asked the question, how much is being spent on developing and promoting the technology, and how much is being spent on anticipating and identifying hazards that, as you mentioned recently, would help to protect this promising technology from a future disaster, you found that 95% was spent promoting the technology and 5% identifying hazards. That doesn't sound like a sensible ratio. Where would you pitch it, and how do we get that ratio of research funding in the next 10 years? That's the first question. The second question is, you mentioned that the P-net ratio, you'll have to explain that a little bit, and associated stuff, was something that, and I quote, was the first impetus to putting present knowledge to use in a practical way for the protection of ecosystems from hazardous chemicals back in 1989. And that is still the basis for risk assessment of chemicals. A simple, crude, tool that cut through a lot of complexities and acknowledged uncertainties, but was workable. It seems like React Now is that kind of tool, really. So how do we enable React Now to play the same kind of role in the control and management of nanotech as P-net ratios and stuff like that did for chemicals?
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. So I think with putting the balance between how much funding we put towards research and development versus environmental health and safety, I think we should probably have a sliding scale, and I would probably start with something with 25%, and then as we generate more and more information about health and safety, we can let that scale go down. But the sad thing is what we've seen the opposite, right? We see billions of euros and US dollars going into development of technology, and then 10 years down the road, we start seeing a larger pile of money going into the environmental health and safety. And then that all equals out to the 3-4% that you mentioned, of course, a lot of different technologies, not just nanotechnology. But I do really would like to see a different sliding of the scale, especially because it's public money that actually runs the innovation within these technologies to begin with. It's like it's billions of euros and US dollars in biotechnology, information technology, and nanotechnology, and they come from the European Commission's research programs. It's not as if it's commercial industries or partners that are actually trying to promote these key enabling technologies. So I think it would be fair to shift the balance a little bit, especially in the beginning. And then you're right, and I think that's also where I'm kind of hanging my hook a little bit with React Now, is that the PEC-PMIC approach was actually suggested by a group of Dutch administrators and some professors that had developed different parts of an exposure assessment framework for chemicals. And they did this based on an requirement by the parliament in the Netherlands to find a viable approach to regulate chemicals. And the report came out in '89, and 3 years later it was adopted in EU-wide legislation, because Europe needed to fix the problem with chemicals. And they made the split between old chemicals and new chemicals, but what transcended, like everything pervasive in that, was PEC-PMIC derivation, and it came from the Dutch, only developed 3 years earlier, pretty much. And now it's the holy grail. We can't change it because it's the way it's always been. But no. It's not the way it's always been. And if you look at the original document, the people that proposed it, they knew everything about the limitations of it. They weren't trying to advocate it as something like, please use this approach. They lined up 4 other approaches and said everything has pros and cons. But the Dutch government said, oh, we will go with this one. And I think that's something that is quite interesting or important to keep in mind. And that's, of course, what I'm also hoping with React Now, that by doing all the work that I could possibly do intellectually, I'm hoping to catch a break, that there might be this window of opportunity, because I think people are increasingly frustrated with the regulatory uncertainty that we have, because it's not only hindering health and safety data generation, but it's also hindering investments in new companies that want to explore nanotechnology. Yeah, thank you very much for your question.
And the second question, ex auditorio, is from Xenia Trier. Xenia Trier is with the European Environmental Agency.
Thank you, Stefan. I also have 3 questions. And thank you also for this presentation and this overview, which also gives us a chance to reflect upon chemical legislation and REACH, which we have heard many times today. And since you asked for a new regulatory framework for nanomaterials, my first question actually relates to the difference between chemicals and nanomaterials. First of all, how would you distinguish between a nanomaterial and a chemical for organic nanomaterials? I mean, such as polymers, for instance. We have now the discussion of plastics and microplastics and nanoplastics. So when is a substance a nanomaterial, and when is it a chemical? Second, and that is similar a little bit to what was mentioned before about the surface chemistry, because in a lot of the effects that you have described and that have been observed are for the mixtures or the finished products, and which is a combination of the nanomaterials and also the surface agents. So how do you distinguish between, again, effects from the nanomaterials and effects from the surface chemistry, the functionalization agents? So that was about the difference between the chemicals and the nanomaterials. The second question was, which would you think are the most important early warning signals for environmental health effects? for nanomaterials? Maybe there's not just one, but if you had to pick a few, what would that be? And finally, this also comes back to another question earlier, which was about the variation in shape and size. Because since we also heard that it's very related to the production process, are you actually suggesting a new methodology by which we do not register the substances or the nanomaterials, but actually the process, as you do in the US? We don't do that in Europe right now, but they do it in the US. So this is a question. Do you think that would be more effective?
Yeah, okay. You have to help me remember the questions. So to begin with, I don't really care about how it's produced. So take the last question first. But I want you to describe how it's produced as part of the registration. But I do want, and I want industry to be able to produce nanoparticles that are very, very similar within a certain range to be further defined. And I want that to not consider nanoparticles separate from what's on their surface. Because I think that makes no sense. So it has to be the nanoparticle, including the core and what's on the surface. The whole nanoparticle. I need some cues here. How do I separate the inorganics or the organics? There I would go for size distribution, like the size. Like if it's between 1 to 100 nanometers, or in that size range, I don't care if it's a polymer or if it's a metal or whatever. It has the functions of being a nanomaterial and falls under that definition. So I wouldn't distinguish between the two. And of course you can have different change, and that creates problems, but it already creates problems with polymers. Yeah.
But okay, but then if you were a manufacturer of, let's say, polymers, would you then have to comply then both with the chemical regulation and with the nanomaterial regulation if there were two different ones?
Yes.
Because they would fall in both categories.
If you have one that is in the nano range and you have one that's outside the nano range, you would have to comply with two different pieces of legislation. Just as you have if you use the exact same chemical to treat something that falls under the biocidal legislation versus the pesticide legislation. It can be the exact same chemical, you just have two different applications, and that would be the same.
In that case, I think you can add all polymers to nanomaterials, because they all release oligomers, which are in the nanorange size.
Is that a problem?
No, I'm just saying that you have to extend your database of 3,000 substances to include all polymers.
But we don't see the nano claim being made for polymers, at least not in our
no, but if you go and search for oligomer migration, you can ask your colleagues here at DTU. There's a lot of studies on that, but they haven't been tested for maybe by the nanomaterial by nanomaterial technologies. And it was back in I used to work here at the DTU, and it was a discussion whether to include it or not at that time for the nanopack. And at that time it was considered that it was only inorganic nanomaterials that fell within the category, but if you include also organic material, you would also have to include the oligomers which migrates out of polymers.
Yep. Was that all the questions?
No, the last question was actually which are the most important early warning signs you consider for environmental
I would actually come back to I think these three here that we tried to implement in our system, whether it's dispersive, whether it causes ecosystem effects, or whether the nanomaterial is novel. I think those are the three key parameters that came out of the late lessons 1, and it's actually the first lesson, how you implement and acknowledge uncertainty. And I think they're pretty good in the sense that if those things are triggered down the road, you will have an issue.
So to be more specific, I think it's actually for the second one, which ecosystem effects would be the most critical ones to look for in early warning signs? I mean, maybe you don't have an idea, but if you had some thoughts on it, would be interesting to know.
We haven't seen studies at this point that actually look at ecosystem effects, but you're talking in general for all chemicals, or?
No, for nanomaterials.
Yeah, we haven't seen ecosystem effects so far reported. It's lab studies and a very few mesocosms that have been completed. Yeah.
Thank you. That was all. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
So now what remains for me is to close the event in here. But before I do, I would like, on behalf of the Technical University of Denmark, to thank the official opponents for their work, which is almost finished by now. And of course also to thank the unofficial opponents ex auditorio for contributing to the discussion here today. So what is going to happen now? The opponents will make their final recommendation on the question on whether to award the Dr. Technicus degree to Steffen Foss Hansen. And this recommendation will be forwarded to the Academic Council, who will then take the final decision on April 6th. And if that is also positive, if they both are positive, then on May 4th, at the annual commemoration party, the university president will present Steffen Foss Hansen with his doctoral letter. In the meantime, I think we can all congratulate Steffen on completing today's defense. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Then, as I mentioned, I hope you will all join us for a small reception just outside these doors. Thank you.
Leave your things here?
Yes, you can leave your things in here. Thank you.
Tusind tak.
Yes,